All right, I'm just going to admit everybody at 7. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Roz Engel, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of New Jersey. Tonight, we're having a conversation about COP26, still ongoing in Glasgow. You've probably been seeing lots of notices in your inbox. And we are very fortunate tonight to have Alex Kazan from Eurasia Group moderating a conversation with Jerry Butts, also of Eurasia Group, but also Canadian government official, past government official, and also Faith Taylor, who will be here, I think, soon. I think she may have just been held up, but I think she'll be joining us very soon. So Alex, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Roz, and thanks everyone. Really great to have all of you this evening for what I think is going to be a really interesting and, of course, very timely conversation with COP26 going on right now in Glasgow, Scotland. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. I'll start with Jerry, and I'll briefly introduce Faith, expecting her to join shortly. But we're really lucky to have Jerry with us this evening. Jerry is not only a colleague of mine at the Eurasia Group, which is a political risk advisory firm where he serves as our vice chairman, running a number of strategic initiatives across the firm. But Jerry brings really a wealth of experience in government and specifically around global climate action, the COP process. He was telling us in the pre-meeting before this, been to countless COPs, and has really rich experience, which I'm looking forward to having him share with all of us this evening. Jerry also, before joining Eurasia Group, was in the Canadian government, where he served as the principal secretary to Prime Minister Trudeau for several years, was really one of the key architects of the Trudeau government, and led really the implementation, execution, formulation of policy for the government, with a big focus on environmental and climate policy. And previously, Jerry has run a number of organizations in Canada, including the World Wildlife Fund. So could not have a better background for this conversation. And let me briefly introduce Faith Taylor before she joins. Faith works for Tesla, which explains why she has been pulled into some urgent business, but will hopefully be joining us, where she leads their environmental, social, and governance efforts. So brings a wealth of experience in the ESG arena to our conversation. She also is a co-founder of the Global Human Trafficking Center and Social Entrepreneurship Program at Montclair State University here in New Jersey, where she was a professor of marketing and management. So hopefully Faith will join us soon. Jerry, let's start with you, and let's start with some real basics here, some scene setting. What is COP? What's it all about? What is this week? So these 2 weeks, COP26. What's going on over in Scotland, and what do the leaders who have assembled there hope to accomplish? You may be on mute, Jerry. Roz, we might have to.
Yeah, I think, Roz, you have to unmute me. You can hear me now, okay?
You are on.
Oh, great. And thanks for having me, Alex. It's great to be here. And like most of these discussions, I'm looking forward to the questions where we've all done a million of these things over the past couple of years now. And I find it the most engaging and fun when we go back and forth in questions. So I'm really looking forward to yours. But let me start with that one. The basics are really simple. COP's been going on for 26 years, since the UN started taking the science of climate change seriously and realizing that it was a problem that, of course, transcended borders and was unable, the UN architecture was ill-equipped to deal with it as a global commons problem. So while most people have started to focus their minds on climate change toward the end of the first decade of this century, the UN has been beavering away on the science and on trying to get countries together to come to some form of multilateral agreement and how we're going to limit global emissions and importantly limit temperature increases across the planet to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I apologize, even as a Canadian, I don't know the quick Fahrenheit translation for that, Alex, but I bet you do. So that's kind of a very, very high level. The COP process, I've been to about 9 of them myself, including 3 that have been called the last chance we have as a species, this being the third, the first being Copenhagen, and the second being the Paris COP, which up until this year, and I would say including this year, is the most important one. The first decade or so of COP was really devoted to having people, to presenting the science and having policymakers and decision makers take the science very seriously. Because of course, once you start to take the science seriously, you realize that it's not a political issue like other political or geopolitical issues. It's really an issue of physics and chemistry. This is what I generally say to introduce the topic to people, that the ocean used to be in one place and it's going to be in another place soon. We used to be able to live comfortably at certain latitudes. We're no longer going to be able to do that if global temperature increases. So while in particular in our 2 countries, I think I saw Faith there, Alex, but in particular in our 2 countries, I'll just wrap up this overview quickly, in Canada and the United States, where the politics of climate change can be very partisan. And I'm grateful that in many countries it's not, and it's treated as a scientific issue to be absorbed and dealt with in the policy process. So that was the first part, the first kind of 10 years of COP was getting people to take the science seriously. The next few years was developing common policy that would allow individual countries both the flexibility to domesticate, if you will, the policy solutions that are appropriate in their own jurisdictions, but achieve a common set of goals that when you put them all together would help us get closer to a 1.5 degree world. And that fulcrum point sort of happened at Paris, and I was part of the negotiating team. We had been elected about 4 weeks before the Paris Accord negotiations were hitting their hottest point. We succeeded a government in Canada that wasn't exactly climate forward, so to speak, in the Harper administration. And so we were kind of thrust right in the middle of the Paris Accord negotiations, which I recall vividly. And you hear a lot of talk about whether people are keeping the spirit of the Paris Agreement or living up to the commitments they made in the Paris Agreement. To me, the breakthrough policy in the Paris negotiations was not a top-down dictation of what each country's national goals would be, but something called, and if you follow climate change, you know there's an alphabet soup of acronyms, but this one is an important one, called an NDC, a nationally determined commitment. So the policy was everybody would agree to act in accordance with the temperature increase outcomes in Paris, which was really 2 degrees with an aspirational goal to get to 1.5 degrees. But crucially, each country would go back to their own domestic political institutions and try and develop a policy that was appropriate for their own jurisdiction in order to achieve that. The theory being that we would all come back at some future COP having achieved success, and that success would be shared and spread between and among countries. And in my view, Alex has heard me say this many times, in the Erasure Group context, there's a cottage industry in running down the Paris Accord. In particular, there has been in our 2 countries, but I always challenge people to name one thing this century other than the Paris Accord the entire world has agreed to do together. And I'm a self-described skeptical optimist when it comes to climate change. I think that we're still in early days in the issue, and what you're seeing now is the maturation of climate change as a public policy issue. It's been a mature scientific issue for many, many years, sadly, but it's now becoming a mature public policy and economic issue. And that may be a good moment to hand it over to Faith, who of course is with one of the companies that saw this are developing earlier than most. The last thing I'll say is, before I worked in the federal government, the third sector, and the private sector, I got my start in politics, running the Premier's office in Ontario, and we are the Michigan of Canada. In fact, I think we produce more vehicles in Ontario than you do in Michigan. A little hometown plug there. And the knock on new auto startups had always been that the barriers of entry were so steep that you'd never see that if change were going to come to the auto sector, it would have to come from one of the existing dominant OEMs. And of course, Tesla proved all of that wrong. So maybe that's a good opportunity to hand the floor to you, Faith.
That's perfect segue. Thank you, Jerry, so much for that. Yeah, Faith, let's bring you into the conversation. As we just heard Jerry kind of lay out for everybody what COP is, what the hopes are for accomplishments out of this process and these specific meetings in Glasgow. But talk to us a little bit about, what the role of the private sector is. We hear a lot about what governments are doing or more likely not doing at COP. What does the private sector do? What does Tesla specifically hope to see come out of this COP and global coordination on climate more generally?
Well, in my mind, at the end of the day, private sector has to provide the solution for the changes that we need. And what we're actually going through now is all of these private sector companies trying to pivot and understand the importance of climate change, and not only private sector companies, but investors understand that we will not have a sustainable revenue stream, livelihood, unless we do invest and move into this area. So in my mind, the role of the private sector is to help facilitate and develop business models that enables us to get there. But we can't do that alone. We have to do it with government, we have to do it with communities, and we have to do it with nonprofit organizations. And so this is a journey because, no one would have told Tesla 10 years ago that this would be where we're at today, but because the good news is that we are here today, that companies understand the importance of what needs to be done. And I'm hopeful that we'll partner with all of the organizations to make that happen. COP26, our goal is to demonstrate that through our business model that you can effectively make change. And the other thing is to show the leadership that the private sector can provide in this space. You have to have examples of how to get there and do what we need to have done. And the only way to do that is through profitable, sustainable businesses that are doing this. And as you probably are aware of, that, Tesla has been at this for many, many years and became profitable last year, and now is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. And so that whole paradigm of taking 10 years to develop the model, but also prove that it is a viable solution to climate change, to me, is critical. And we need to see more of that across the world, but it has to be, in my mind, in partnership with communities, and it has to be linked to economic development of underserved communities through these business models. And so as we work through this, one of the things I'm proud of working with Tesla is that we have a program where when we go into local communities, we have apprenticeships for those who don't necessarily have a college education, where they can learn the skills of our products and services and have viable jobs and opportunities to improve their livelihood associated with a product that is actually helping to reduce the environmental footprint that they're impacting. So linking that is very, very important. Economic development to workforce development to providing jobs and livelihoods for those who are underserved is important. And as we continue to build this, I truly believe that we have to look at it more from that perspective than not only global programs and policies. Because at the end of the day, consumers are the ones who are going to live this and are living this. We're all living through it. And you have to have tangible results and programs, products that touches people's lives. And so when I look at this and having been in the space for many years, I've come more into saying, you know what, we have to touch the communities, the cities where people live, where they're at, to really make a difference, because I no longer believe it's just you do need overarching policies, you do need overarching legislation, but I also understand the basic need that needs to be fundamentally met. So that's where I believe our role and what we can play in this.
Yeah, there's a lot there. My mind is racing with follow-up questions. I mean, really interesting overview, but just a couple of things. Faith, you mentioned a couple of times the word partnership, this notion that, you know, the private sector is driving a lot of change. Ultimately, that's going to be required, but you need communities, you know, you need to work hand in glove with communities, and governments have a lot to do. So when you know, just bringing it back to what's going on in Scotland right now, when you look at governments around the world coming together, what do you, from your perspective, leading on these issues for a company like Tesla, what do you want to see governments do? What does partnership look like, you know, from the government side, from your perspective?
So I think one of the things that's hardest about partnership for governments is not necessarily only looking at the global policy, but how are they looking at their regions and cities, and how they're partnering with private sector technology companies to actually implement solutions on a smaller scale that can then be networked on a bigger scale. I actually, when I'm looking at what is going on, I am concerned whether we'll get to the agreements by all countries. I am concerned whether we will get to all the financing that we need by all countries. I am more optimistic if I were to see regional, city, community programs that was run by governments to develop solutions that are networked in that manner and financed in that manner. I feel like we may get more done than necessarily focusing on the global policy. Because just watching over the years, we have made progress. Let's just say this: we have a Paris Agreement. People have signed up, but when you look at boots on the ground, that's where I'm really getting concerned about what we are able to accomplish and what we can accomplish. But I've seen some tremendous examples where we can actually emulate those and use those as examples to accelerate change. And at the end of the day, it's about the people in the communities and how we're actually developing that to make a change. And to be honest, people respond to what's in it for me, how is it impacting my family? Can I actually see the results that are happening in our lives? And they are experiencing climate change, we all are, but what do you see on a granular level that you can actually be a part of at these community, city, regional levels? So I'm much more focused on that, to be honest with you, in terms of how we develop those solutions in that manner is going to be critical.
That's a really interesting point. I want to bring Jerry, you back in on this. So Faith is suggesting that there's a lot of ways that the climate agenda is going to advance that don't necessarily depend on diplomats getting together at these annual summits. Has COP to some extent outlived its usefulness, or sort of its original purpose, now that we're 20 some years on, 25 plus years on in this global discussion? Has the need for COP evolved? Are there better, different venues that you think will be more effective in advancing the policies and behavioral changes needed?
Yeah, I think it has, and I'm struggling to think of a single thing Faith just said that I disagree with. I think it's, I think she's bang on. I think the appropriate role for public policy in dealing with a comprehensive issue like climate change is to set a long-term goal, develop the policy instruments required to get there, but then largely give the private sector the space to innovate to achieve those goals. I don't think anybody believes that we could achieve our climate targets in either of our countries through a state planned apparatus. That's for sure. And the other point that Faith made that I think is a related one, but a really important one, I'll get back to your question in a second, Alex, is that you know, the difficulty in getting people to act on climate change has largely been associated with the magnitude of the issue, right? That it's hard to get people to worry about climate change until they're up to their waist in water or their house is surrounded by a wildfire. I think that we've seen a kind of global awakening, if I can use that word, emerge in the last probably 5 years on climate change, as the images, the technology we've developed to communicate with one another has facilitated the lightning speed spread of these images, so that there's always a wildfire somewhere and there's always a flood somewhere. So it's hard to keep climate change out of your mind, whereas up until now it's been relatively easy. COP itself, I think, has evolved and it will evolve. It was primarily a negotiation forum that was populated. I'm not even sure which year the leaders of the government showed up. It was well into the teens, I believe, where it became a kind of mandatory performance for the heads of the largest governments to appear and to account for themselves and their policies. But I think the helpful turn it's taken, and you see this year, is it's moved from a negotiation forum to one that's a lot more like a state fair, right? That countries show up with their private sectors in tow, and the private sector kind of takes the stage. And you saw this certainly at this COP, and it was prevalent in more and more prevalent at every subsequent COP that I attended from Copenhagen forward. So I think this is a good thing. Personally, I don't think it was a rational expectation for us to think that the governments of the world would sit down and come to an agreement and then they go home and tell everybody what to do to transform their entire economies. I think that was politically naive in the first place. And now we're in a much more, we're in a spot where we can make a lot of progress because of the kinds of partnerships that Faith has described, which were virtually non-existent a decade ago, are blossoming all over the place.
Faith, one of the things you talked about was the importance of ensuring, that communities are not impacted negatively, that economic growth is supported, that there's investment. And we hear, one of the phrases that we talk a lot about is this notion of a just transition, that the shift to effectively addressing climate is going to mean a lot of changes in how we generate energy, in how we run the economy, and that these transitions are going to cause a lot of dislocations for people. Now, normally we talk about that in the global context, right? It's in the context of a notion of equity, that so much of the emissions, historical emissions, have been from the developed countries. And we think of it in terms of that poor countries needing to have some space to catch up. But what you talked about was very much in the local context. And I wonder if you can go into a little bit more depth about this notion of ensuring kind of just, fair transitions in more of a US context and a community context. Our members are all local in New Jersey. How do you kind of localize thinking about climate change, the economic changes that will be needed, and the impact on communities?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways that we could do that, right? It's through providing job and training to those who are underserved in the community and giving them a bridge to economic development. So whether it is through in the community colleges or in the high school, giving them technical skills in this area, whether it's servicing EVs, whether it is developing solar panels, whether it's installation, which we offer in communities, and you are not required to have a college degree to do this, but we have apprenticeship programs that go from 12 weeks for those who are just doing service to those who are more technically oriented 2-year apprenticeships where you actually help them get these types of skills and be able to have jobs that enable them to lift themselves and their families up. Another way to do it is actually to offer solutions, right, for communities of color in terms of energy. So a way to do that is to enable a solar installation across many homes in certain communities and allow our power walls and power packs to consolidate that energy where they can actually offset the cost of that and therefore lower the cost of energy that goes into their home and even enable them to sell that energy back to the grid. And that whole concept is called democratization of the use of energy. And I truly believe that that's what's going to have to happen because our grids are very vulnerable. So we have to start to develop different solutions for that. So when you look at the products, and if we can actually do that on scale in underserved communities and give them that capability and give them that ability to have financing in a different way and offset their expenses in a different way, that is actually enabling them to have control and have a say in what's happening in their neighborhood. So those are a couple of ways that we can do that through our business model, and that's local. That is not on, we're trying to do this grand scale program, but we're trying to do it, one home, one community at a time and enabling that. So we work with local community colleges. We work with local nonprofit groups. We work with local high schools. We work with the government and economic development programs, and we work with them and say, okay, this is the budget that we're going to allocate, and we're going to work with you to make sure that happens. But we do that, and then we actually go back and say, what did we do, and did we actually accomplish the goals that we wanted to do in terms of education, in terms of actually employing people, and so forth. So it is, to be honest with you, it's a lot of hard work. It's not easy, but if it's part of your business model, it also enables you to have a pipeline of great employees and enables you to diversify. We are a majority minority company. I don't think most people know that about Tesla. They think a technology company, but that's not true. But when I think about, how this needs to be done, that to me is something that's very granular, and it touches a lot of people, and there's a multiplier effect.
That's really interesting. I want to encourage everybody to put questions in the chat. I've got a million and could go all night, but the hope here is to engage everybody. So please do put questions in the chat, and then we'll call on you and unmute you. But while we wait for people to think of questions, Jerry, I'd love for you to reflect on what Faith just said. Canada is, I think, viewed by much of the world, and rightly so, as a leader on a lot of climate and environmental issues. But that's typically at the national and international level. Can you reflect on some of those community-based and private sector-driven initiatives that Faith talked about in the US context? Are you seeing that in Canada, but also in other big markets around the world, to the point where that becomes a viable kind of vector of change?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that historically we've largely not deserved our reputation as progressive climate actors in Canada. We are, depending on which measure you use, either the first, second, or third most emitting country per capita in the world. And it's easy for us to say that it's because it's big and cold and dark up here, but there are other big and cold, dark places. So I would never be one to run my own country down, but I think it's important that we have an accurate self-image of what we've done in the past in Canada. And while I'm not entirely unbiased on this for the reasons you expressed in my introduction, Alex, I think we've done a lot better job in the last 5 or 6 years than we had previously. We've still got a long way to go here. And that's probably truer in our private sector than it is in our public sector these days, that we have a relatively closed economy at the top of the economy, even though we're amongst the most trading nations of the world. Our finance, telecom, energy sectors, especially our finance and telecom sectors, are relatively closed. And they're deeply invested in some of the highest carbon industries in the world. So it's been a very difficult transition here in Canada. And of course, as you know, but nobody else on this call would, I come from the east coast of Canada. My father was a coal miner for 40 years. And I lived through the collapse of the coal industry in Atlantic Canada when I was a kid. So I know really personally what happens to communities when the dominant industry is suddenly no longer viable. So I think, and to couple that from another personal perspective, my wife's the child of an auto worker who grew up in Windsor, Ontario, which little interesting piece of geography is actually south of Detroit. I think Roz, as a Midwesterner would know that, but you know, we are going through a big macro change, and with all big macro changes, people get left behind. And historically, we've said all the right things, but we haven't really cared. I mean, I grew up in a community that went from 5 to 25% unemployment, and lots of good faith, half-hearted efforts were made to do something about it, but none of them really worked. And I think one of the most encouraging things about the global climate transition conversations that are going on is that people are starting to think about this before people start to lose their jobs. And it's a very difficult situation after it all happens, where you come in and try and clean up a mess. But when you're trying to think progressively about how you deal with massive economic and employment dislocation for people whose jobs and livelihoods, and in some cases communities, are disappearing. That to me is job one, not just for policymakers, but for all of us as human beings, right? Like, we should deeply care about this. And I'm encouraged by what I see within industrialized countries. I think the bigger issue, and maybe I'll finish here, Alex, there are kind of two just transition conversations, and we're talking about the one that's going on between within our own countries. But of course, the big picture issue is that there's 1 trillion tons of carbon pollution in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there. And we put it all there, guys. You know, it's when you hear these conversations about it's pointless to do anything in the United States or Canada or Europe unless India and China does X, Y, or Z. Like, we caused this problem, right? So there's a moral responsibility there, from my perspective, that people in emerging markets are very quick to point out, and sometimes in their own self-interest, but an immediate self-interest. But it's a real point, and it's a real problem, and we've got to account for that somehow in the way we look at ourselves.
Yeah, I want to come back to that second facet of the just transition, the sort of between country, which I think is obviously, you know, when you look at the geopolitics of it, really the key issue right now. But we're starting to get some good questions in the chat. So I want to turn to our audience. Our first question, Gerald Cohen, you have a question on carbon pricing.
Yes, so I should say I'm an economist, so I'm asking this from an economist perspective. So economists across the political spectrum, at least in the US, believe that carbon pricing, carbon trading, carbon tax, however, whatever you want to call it, would be one of the most effective ways of limiting carbon emissions. What are the chances we ever get there, and when do you think that would potentially happen? I know putting a date and a number is challenging, or do you think we will ever get there, and in what time frame?
Well, in the Canadian, we were already there, and I spent half my life fighting for it. So I think that we're not already there. We have this year a $30 a ton carbon price that will go up to $170 a ton by the end of 2030. And I like to present the Canadian example as one that should give Americans who want to see carbon pricing in place hope, right? Like it was as dead as a doornail as a political issue as recently as 2012, the 2011 election. 2 elections in a row were in part decided on it. And then the next 3 were won by a party that campaigned to do it. So I'm one who believes that people make politics, right? And that if you organize the right way, then you can make big things happen. I think and I understand why he didn't, had the former President Obama spend as much time on climate change as he did on Obamacare, you'd probably have a more robust climate policy and a worse healthcare policy. So your system can only absorb so much change in a short period of time. But I think the biggest enemy of carbon pricing in the United States is the consensus opinion that it could never happen. And it's the most effective policy in the world. So for once, the economists are right.
Yeah, I think it's a ongoing, in the United States, it's an ongoing work in progress. And we have so many challenges, but there's no excuse. It probably is the most effective policy at the end of the day. But I can't put a number and I can't put a price at this point. I really can't.
Great. And then we also have a question from Lillian. I think this one is directed at you, Faith.
Hello, my name is Lillian. How are you?
Good.
Thank you all for your time. My question is, the urban cities, they're always not that much receptive to change because they're just going on with their daily lives. So how can we what can we do to say, you need to change your carbon footprint for your own? They're not necessarily aware that they're breathing bad air because they are, and they're, so how can we get them to change that? Like, what can we do? Like, my mother lives in an urban area that's very polluted, and trying to get things to change there. How do we convince them?
Yeah, so I live right next door to Newark, New Jersey, and Newark is, I'm not sure where you live, Lillian, but an urban city, as you know, that has many challenges. And I've been part of this organization called NJPAC, but what we've been involved with is economic development and working within the schools and communities to actually develop some sustainable programs, and working with the mayor of the city, Mayor Ras Baraka, but more importantly, to help get financing and putting front and center some of the major issues. As you know, clean water is a major issue. The pipes are very old, and developing solutions with private partners of how we're going to actually clean that up. So that is really within the cities. You have to do it within the schools and educating the parents, and then actually working with the local mayor and governments and the school board to actually develop a program, a project, a committee to focus in on that, and then actually working with private sector. For example, in the city of Newark, you have Prudential, which is right there in the city, who is a partner in that. So it definitely is what I call a partnership between organizations that's at the school level, at the government level, more grassroots government groups, and then a private sector helping to develop that solution. So, but it's not easy. And so, it's interesting because at those school boards, you will see people who are very effective at bringing the subject up, but more than just bringing the subject up, it is actually saying, what is our plan to address it and do something about it? And then partnering with a private organization to actually develop the resources to get that done. So I found that to be the most effective. I don't know where you're living now, Lillian. Where do you live?
I'm in Middlesex, so it's a little different, but my mother still lives in Newark, New Jersey. So
Okay. So if you know, yeah, if you want to, after this, get a hold of me and, you want to talk about who you can be in contact with. And, your concern is very well heard, known, and whatever I can help to facilitate that, let me know.
yes, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Great. And then Ben, I think you have a question about the agenda of fossil fuel companies. Why were they at COP? You able to come off mute?
Yeah,
There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So, I recently read in an article that the largest group represented at COP26 was the fossil fuel industry. And it made me question, what was their agenda at the COP26? What were they trying to achieve collectively? Because I wasn't quite sure. And then, where do you think, in your opinion, as experts in this area, what do you think their position is in the next 5 years as an industry in this process of change? What's I obviously, looking at profits and sustainability, what is that balance that they're going to have to find a position in this future, knowing that a lot of fingers are pointed in their direction to the problems that we're in now?
Jerry, do you maybe want to lead with that? Lead on that one, and then you're on mute. Sorry, we're having chronic muting issues.
That's okay. It's par for the course in this golden era of Zoom. It's a great question. And I would say you should be skeptical but not cynical about the commitments that are being made by fossil fuel companies. I think that there's a lot of variation within the industry. I think it's funny, I was smiling when you were saying, why are there so many fossil fuel companies showing up at COP26? It's kind of like if the turkeys could all show up to plan Thanksgiving policy, they probably would too. They're there because they're going to be affected by the decisions made at and around those tables, probably more directly and more immediately than any other industry in the world. So that's important. And then the other thing, which I say all the time, and it's a lot of people don't realize this, depending on how you count it, about 80 to 85% of fossil fuel production in the world is done by state-owned enterprises. So in a sense, the fossil fuel companies, as long as the governments are there, the fossil fuel companies are always there, because most fossil fuel production is owned pretty directly by one government or another. We think in the North American context of the Exxons and the Chevrons as the massive policymakers in the fossil fuel industry, but Freudian slip, companies like Saudi Aramco, Equinor, Petronas dwarf those companies, both in their ability to move the market and therefore their ability to set policy. So that's kind of the first part of your question. The second part, I think, is a really difficult one to ascertain. I think some fossil fuel companies that take the energy transition very seriously and have an express goal to turn themselves into energy companies, and those are largely the European super majors, the Shells, the BPs, the Totals of the world, stand a fighting chance. But I think that over the next 5 years, where there's still going to be a mismatch between the world's need for usable energy, and we have an energy system that's primarily reliant on carbon atoms, and until we get to one that's primarily reliant on renewable electrons, there's going to be a lot of pricing power in the fossil fuel sector. So the short answer is, in the short term, I think the fossil fuel industry is going to make a lot of money. And because there's going to be high demand and there's going to be a relatively tight supply, and nobody's investing CapEx long-term in the sector outside of the state-owned enterprises. in the mid to longer term, even in the most aggressive scenarios where we use just south of 100 million barrels of oil a day today globally, somewhere around 95. And even in the most aggressive scenarios by the middle of the century, we'll still be somewhere around 50, right? So you start to think about the geographies that are well positioned to supply that 50 million barrels, and it's low cost, low carbon, relatively low risk producers like the Gulf states and Russia. So you're going to have a lot of pricing and market power, and therefore a not immaterial amount of geopolitical power in those jurisdictions as the higher cost, higher carbon, higher risk jurisdictions start to fall off the production tranche.
Great. Roz, I think you have a couple of questions for Jerry as well.
Yeah, I actually wanted to make one point too, which was kind of like, this is gonna be a little crosstalk between the economists, because I'm gonna like say something to Gerald, but the IMF had a really interesting report. Like, I don't know if you saw this, Gerald, 2 years ago, where they did a whole thing on the estimating the effect of a $35 per metric ton carbon tax. I think that was and it was very interesting. They did a really, it seemed like a thorough report. And what they did find though was it was really regressive, which was kind of interesting. And that there was going to need to be quite a lot of policies to think through how to deal with the regressivity of the tax. So I don't know, that might be a kind of an interesting topic for tonight, which is if you were going to do some of these policies and they did turn out to be regressive, especially on the tax side, what might you do? I mean, there's some debates about, for example, should we simply just take lump sums, just take the income, the tax revenue and just push it back out? Or should we be trying to do more active redistributive, kind of try to meet some social welfare goals that we might have as well? And then of course that becomes very partisan and then it kind of breaks down. So anyway, just kind of add that little piece there. But I did want to ask, that we've seen a lot of pledges coming out of COP26. Again, pretty much every kind of fossil fuel and gas and methane and everything else has been discussed. I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us which ones, maybe Faith and Jerry, which ones did you find most interesting? When I say interesting, it could be surprising, it could be weird, it could be whatever. Which ones did you find most interesting and why?
Go. I know I'm sitting here. It's interesting because I saw the methane one, and I was really trying to understand, and I understand because it has one of the highest global warming potentials, but I also know that it's one of the hardest ones to control because permafrost, as you know, as it disappears, the methane will increase exponentially. And so I'm really trying to figure out how we will actually get there, given the environmental changes that are accelerating that. So I thought it was very interesting, and I understand why, but I'm really puzzled as to how we're going to get there. Does that make sense? Because I really think it's probably the most challenging, and I can understand the commitments, but I really wonder if people understood how they will be able to make an impact in that area. So anyway, I haven't seen a lot of science to say how we will help that and solve for it. That's just my thoughts. I'm just talking from what I see.
Jerry, over to you on that. What commitments did you find most interesting or troubling?
Well, I think the one that surprised me most, and it's easy to be cynical about it, but I think it's a really positive step, is India joining the Net Zero Club. And their date is so far off, it sounds half-baked, which it probably is. But the fact that they felt the need to make that commitment by 2070 is a really important one, in my view. They were next to China. China gets a lot of bad press, deservedly, for its coal use, but coal use in India has tripled this century, and it would quickly surpass China as the king of coal by the middle of the century if it didn't make aggressive curtailment commitments. Roz, I will say that you're absolutely right about the IMF study. That was in the absence of any other policy measures. And I sound like a total homer tonight, sorry, but I commend to you the Canadian policy, because our policy rebates the entire carbon tax back to families, right? And it's graded by income. And I think, if I remember correctly, above $200,000 in income, you don't get anything back. So there is a way, effectively, all you're doing is creating a pool of revenue that the government can distribute as it sees fit according to policy. So my strong view is that it became not only an acceptable but a popular policy in Canada when it was specifically targeted at raising revenue to deal with income inequality.
Great. I want to encourage people, sort of last chance to put questions in the chat. We still have some more time, so if people have questions, please do put them in the chat. Jerry, you mentioned when Roz asked about the commitments, India's net zero commitment, and that kind of comes back to what we had alluded to earlier. This big fundamental question about sort of a just transition from a global perspective, the sort of burden sharing of future emissions reductions, and what kind of impact that will have on economic growth and development, and the fairness questions around that, given varying levels of economic development. Can you kind of give us how has that issue become an obstacle to progress, both at this COP, but more generally, and how do you break through it? What's some of the background and what you think is likely to eventually, hopefully, I mean, it has to happen, to break that logjam?
Sure. Well, this is a crude oversimplification of it, Alex, but the basic argument goes something like this. You guys created this problem by industrializing the old-fashioned way, and now you want to limit our ability to industrialize after you've already gotten there and you've become rich and invested in cleaning up your own industries. And that's not fair, because we have a bunch of poor people who deserve just as much as your citizens do to have relatively comfortable lives. And I don't think it's much more complicated than that. And frankly, like most successful political arguments, its simplicity is its charm, right? The challenge, of course, is that the atmosphere doesn't care where carbon is emitted, whether it's in New Jersey or Ontario or Bangladesh or South Africa. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day where a carbon atom is emitted rather. And we've got to come to, that has been, I would say, the central sticking point in the COP negotiations since the Copenhagen COP, which I think was 2009, but don't hold me to that. It might have been 2010. The second breakthrough in Paris was to commit to kind of redouble the developed world's efforts to finance the transition in the developing world, and to pay to help deal with the consequences of climate change. I think the most moving image to come out of the Glasgow COP was one of the ministers from Tuvalu decided to give his press conference knee deep in seawater. Didn't go to COP, but it was broadcast at the plenary at COP. And that's a really powerful image, because to you and me, for the most part, this issue is about how we adjust our lifestyles and which products we buy, and maybe we have to move a little bit farther away from the sea, but it's a truly existential issue for small island nations that could be wiped off the map within our lifetime. So I think that you get through it by the way you get through all very difficult issues. It's people of good faith on both sides trying to come to agreements that everybody can abide by. And to get all the way back to the point about India, what Modi asked for in return for the 2070 commitment was $100 billion a year in finance to decarbonize the Indian economy. So his argument is, we want to do what you want us to do, but we don't have the money to do it, so you should pay for it. You can see how the politics get tricky, but I think we're going to end up with that kind of those kind of arrangements to deal with those kinds of issues over the next 5-10 years.
Faith, did you have anything to add to that? I mean, I'd love to hear, how does, Tesla, and how do you think about this from a global perspective, and what is, to Jerry's point about the urgency and the need to address this, what is the role of Tesla and the private sector more generally in helping developing countries with that adjustment?
I mean, as we're looking at building out the company, and we actually are successfully in China and working with them in terms of economic development and working with the factory. We're looking at some other relationships globally. And I think at the end of the day, when you talk about sharing the burden, Jerry, you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter where you're at. The impact, climate change impact is all of us. But I really do believe in emerging markets. It's all about the economic development of their countries, and they're all about being able to adapt and rebuild and have jobs for their people. So to me, the role that private sector plays is through our business models. Can we help them have resources and help the people on the ground as they're trying to adapt by having businesses there actively employing and providing solutions to them as we're going through this process. And I think at the end of the day, I know the most severely impacted are the people of color and all of the communities that don't have the funds to rebuild when we have these disasters. But if you have a company there, you're going to be very much involved with rebuilding. So how we do that is going to be critical. And to me, that's the role that the private sector can play in the underserved communities. Is as we have these businesses, we want to make them resilient. We want to help the people in the community to be resilient. And how do we help do that as we have to adapt? And so that's much more tactical. It's at the country level. It's through our business. And I know that has, great meaning to a lot of these countries. And so we have relationships with them because of that.
Yeah. I see we have another question from Lillian on this US and China announcement. Lillian?
Yeah, I know it's relatively new, so I don't know if you have much information, but what does that mean? Like, I'm assuming that it's good, but what would that look like for, like, what do you think they would do? I'm just curious about it because I know it's recent and I haven't really read anything about it, but I'm just seeing if the two both of you can chime in on this, please.
Yeah, it's hot off the press, as they say. I haven't really had a chance to go through it. I know some of our colleagues at Eurasia Group have, and we were going back and forth on email about it just before I joined this call. So I'm hesitant to say anything. I will say that I'm a little skeptical of 11th hour interventions in major undertakings, and that's what this has to feel about it.
I'm going to be very conservative, done a lot of work in China with companies, and I'm going to take a wait and see. I totally agree. You can't, we need to wait and see.
Okay.
Yeah, I would give it some time.
So I have a last question for both of you. Jerry, you described yourself as a, was it skeptical optimist or cautious optimist? We've talked a lot about constraints, right? A lot about all the things that make it hard to get anything done on this issue that increasingly feels existential. Let's close on an upbeat note. Give us some things, whether it was out of COP or just more generally, to have some reasons for optimism here, either at the global level or at the community level, as Faith keeps reminding us, which I think is really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, look, my biggest source of optimism is embodied in companies like Tesla. I think that it's almost insane to think that we reached the peak of our innovative, creative capacity as a species somewhere around the turn of the 19th century, when we industrialized using coal and largely fossil fuels. I think that maybe this is the Trekkie in me coming out. I watched a lot of Star Trek as a kid, but I really do believe that we're at the beginning of really important scientific innovation that will give us great insight into how to use the energy that we're awash in, right? Like there's no shortage of total energy on planet Earth. We just have found a very convenient, disruptive, and method of deploying it that has a lot of downside consequences. And I refuse to believe that the only way we can power a modern economy is by sunlight that has been stored for several billion years, burning sunlight that has been stored for several billion years. It doesn't make any sense to me.
And, I agree. At the end of the day, we have created it, and I believe we have the technological innovation to solve for it. If no one would have told us that, our cell phones are more powerful than the computers we use to send the first men to the moon. And the scale in which we are able to use technology, I am really encouraged that companies are now really understanding the need to pivot, and they understand that hopefully the sense of urgency that needs to happen. I'm also encouraged by the investment community, and the amount of funding that is now being allocated to this, and the sense of importance that it's taking to understand how environmental social governance has to be a key criteria for investment. And as the dollars go, I truly believe will help us to drive the solutions on a global basis. So I'm very encouraged with that, because I remember many years of trying to convince not only my CFO, but working with investors and saying why this is important. And now they're asking, what are you doing? So I think that's a better place to be in than where we were before. I'm also encouraged by our children. I truly believe that they get it. And they don't look at what I call economic development and having all of these goods and services like we do. And so I believe they are our future, and that they, I'm hoping that our generation can help provide a platform for solutions, but that they lead us into the next century in a way that is more humane, sustainable, and equitable. So I'm encouraged by them. My children are them, so that's where I'm at. And I see what they're doing. I see their values. I see so many passionate and doing, not just talking, but doing things in this area. So, I believe that we're going to get there. And, we're on the path.
I love that. I see that in my kids. I know Jerry and I have talked about this. He sees it in his kids. So really wonderful way to close. Let me send it back to Roz, who might have some concluding thoughts here before we wrap up for the evening.
I just want to thank you. Thank you, Faith. It was great to bring you into the council conversation and kind of make you part of our New Jersey foreign policy conversation here. Alex, thanks for doing a great job moderating, and thank you, Jerry, so much for joining us. And I just want to say, I think this is exactly what we want to try and do, which is take a big, huge global problem that seems like it's very far away and have some conversations about how it might matter for us here at home. So thank you all very much. And I hope you have a great night. And we'll, bated breath to the end of COP26, almost there. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.